Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to our weekly convocation here at Monte Vista Grove in Pasadena, California. Our convocations for this year have a theme, cultivating inclusive community. And today we're talking about how churches communicate and cultivate true community. Terry McGonigal will read the scripture and say a prayer and introduce our speakers. Terry?
Yeah, thank you. Our scripture comes from the Message, chapter 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 to 25. It's a familiar passage about how Paul views the nature of the gospel. And the reason I chose this, because our topic for today, which will be led by our two speakers who I'll introduce in a moment, is the digital transformation of the church. And that topic presumes that there's a technology that is now available to us, digital technology, and how is it that the church uses that for the purposes of evangelism and discipleship and engagement with the culture and equipping disciples. And behind this passage that I'm about to read is also the assumption of a technology. Paul talks about where he was sent and how he was sent there. Well, the technology that Paul utilized was the Roman road in the first century. It was a new technology. It allowed for travel, primarily built for swift movement of Roman military power. But Paul used that technology to travel all over the empire to proclaim the gospel in the first generation after the ministry of Jesus. And then what he brought was this message using the technology of the Roman road. We're going to talk about using the technology of digital transformation. So here's the passage for today. Jonas, would you put it up, please? The message that points to Christ on the cross seems like sheer silliness to those hell-bent on destruction. But for those on the way of salvation, it makes perfect sense. This is the way God works. And most powerfully, as it turns out, for it is written, I'll turn conventional wisdom on its head. I'll expose so-called experts as shams. So where can you find someone truly wise, truly educated, truly intelligent in this day and age? Hasn't God exposed it all as pretentious nonsense? Since the world in all its fancy wisdom never had a clue when it came to knowing God, God in wisdom took delight in using what the world considered stupid, preaching of all things, to bring those who trust him into the way of salvation. While Jews clamor for miraculous demonstrations and Greeks go in for philosophical wisdom, we go right on proclaiming Christ, the crucified one. Jews treat this like an anti-miracle, and Greeks pass it off as absurd. But to us who are personally called by Jesus Christ, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is God's ultimate miracle and wisdom, all wrapped in one. Human wisdom is so cheap, so impotent, next to the seeming absurdity of God. Human strength can't begin to compete with God's weakness. So I introduce to you now two people who are going to help us think about how that message of Jesus can go out into the world today using our current technology. So I'm thrilled to introduce two people, one of whom I know, the other one I don't, from Seattle Pacific University, a sister institution to where I was for 27 years at Whitworth University in Spokane. Seattle Pacific University is right in the middle of that very important city that really has become one of the springboards of the digital transformation of the entire world, with enterprises like Microsoft and Amazon right there. Doug Strong is a member of the School of Faculty, teaches at the undergraduate and graduate level, provides tremendous leadership as the School of Theology at SPU, really enables people to communicate the gospel in the context of the culture of Seattle. Michael Paulus, who I've never met, is associate provost, oversees their operations in the library, but also has a deep passion for how the current technologies can be used to transform the church. Michael, I just learned, is a member of Bethany Presbyterian Church, not far from where the Seattle Pacific University campus is located. So Michael and Douglas, we really look forward to hearing from you, and we're thrilled to have you here, and thank you for the wisdom that you will impart to us. So why don't you go ahead and take it?
Well, thank you very much, Terry. It's good for us to be here. We're really blessed to be in your presence and among such an auspicious group of people. I'm here actually out of the invitation of Ron White, who was my mentor in my doctoral program, and also I was his teaching assistant many years ago. And I have a great fondness for him. He's doing some other gig today, so I'm not able to be with him, but I'm so pleased and that he extended this invitation to us. And he did so because he had heard about this project that we've been doing here at Seattle Pacific University called the Digital Transformation of the Church. We received a grant from the Murdoch Charitable Trust, a foundation in our vicinity that gave us a little bit of money in order to do this project. It's, I'll be frank with you, the project that I'm going to give you some statistics from, which is the Hartford Seminary project about, which did data gathering related to how churches have reacted to the pandemic. That project from Hartford Seminary got $5.9 million from the Lilly Foundation, and we here at Seattle Pacific got $10,000 from the Murdoch Trust. We're grateful for what we received, but obviously we weren't able to do quite what the Hartford Seminary people did. Nonetheless, we had a great deal of fun, and this project linked together the School of Theology, which at that time I was the dean of, and now I'm a professor in, with the library and the digital technology folks at our university, and especially with Dr. Michael Paulus, who is the true expert. As a theologian, and especially as a church historian, which is my field, I have to say that I am probably the most Luddite of people maybe in this whole screen, and indeed came to the idea of digital transformation kicking and screaming. But you know, what we've realized since the time of the pandemic is we can't afford to be that kind of people. The church, the educational communities, our whole world, it needs the technology that we have, and we're very grateful for it. And so I'm a convert to the need for digital transformation, and I'm so grateful to have my colleague with me who saw this long before I did. The other thing that I would like to say is that we are both, that is Michael and I are both graduates of Princeton Theological Seminary and proud of it. And so I've been in hallowed Presbyterian halls, but Michael's the true Presbyterian. He's certainly been predestined for this role. And I freely chose to be a Methodist. And so I'm afraid that I'm an interloper among you. So you'll have to forgive me. Nonetheless, it's my pleasure to talk to you a bit. What our project did, this digital transformation of the church, was actually during COVID, was completely to have a number of gatherings of pastors and leading church leaders to help them to think through how does the church actually transform itself through the grace of God to be able to do ministry in a new setting, in a new context. And after all, as Terry mentioned with Paul, this is nothing new. The church has had to adapt and to use technology in every era. Certainly the Reformation, for example, would never even occurred without the printing press having been invented just a few years prior. So, and then we can give example after example of this, and it's true today. And so technology is neither good nor bad, it's how we use it. And this particular set of technologies that we have now, we have to think about, and actually, as I mentioned, I would say that we're grateful for them given what we've had to endure the last couple of years. And so I'm going to begin for just a few minutes to give you some statistics based on this study that I mentioned to you, the Hartford Seminary study that really completed their work last fall. So if it's just a few months old, the data. And then I'm going to turn it over to Michael. My part of this will be somewhat depressing, to be honest with you, because I'm going to be giving you data about some of the difficulties and challenges that churches have faced in this pandemic period. And then we'll shift to Michael, who will be much more of the optimist, I hope, in letting us think a little bit about what the future could hold with digital technology that we have for us. So let me just begin. Again, as I mentioned, Hartford Seminary got this grant, and they did a survey of 38 Christian denominational groups, which include both my church, the United Methodist Church, and your church, the PCUSA. So both of those plus 36 other denominations. And they did surveys from June to August of last year, and then compiled the data. And what they found are all sorts of things, which you may be interesting. And if you want to access this, by the way, you can just go to Hartford Seminary and look at their data. It's certainly available to all of you. So I'm actually just reporting out what you can look at if you're interested in more of it. But I'm going to highlight a few things that I think are particularly interesting and important for us. For example, 80%, this is as of last fall, 80% of churches are offering hybrid services with both in-person and remote options. Just think of that compared with what would have been 2 years ago. Only 15% of congregations are worshiping just in person, just 15%, and 5% are worshiping only virtually. So 80% are doing some combination. Remarkable, really, when you think that many congregations didn't even have the technology to do this 2 years ago. Another interesting thing has to do with church attendance. I think most of us would imagine that church attendance has declined, and actually that has to be nuanced. So church attendance has actually stayed the same. The median attendance for congregations this past year, 21, is the same as it was prior to that, which is 65. Believe it or not, the median attendance for a church in the United States currently is 65 people. Now, the difference is, of course, is that a lot of that attendance is online rather than in person currently. So that's why our churches look so much emptier. But the actual numbers is exactly the same. However, what that data hides, the same attendance, is that some churches have declined precipitously while others have grown, actually, during the pandemic. And so there has been a great deal of change during this period. So for example, there's actually, if we look from comparing 2019 to 2021, so 2 years, there was actually a 12% overall decline, and 35% of churches reported a decline, but 25% show, 35% show a decline, and others, 15% report an increase. What these numbers show, interestingly, is that there's a turbulent and chaotic situation. This is the main thing, is whether you've declined or grown, it's been a challenging and difficult and chaotic even time for U.S. congregations. And that's across the board. We've seen this is what people are reporting. Even if they've been successful in their delivery model for how they've done worship services, they're still experiencing a lot of overall change. and mostly turmoil. Okay. Interestingly, which churches are the ones that have grown? Well, of the 15% of churches that have remained solely in person in their worship, they've reported the steepest decline of 15.7%. Those who've remained only online, which is only 5% of the congregations, have seen a decline of 7%. But for the 80% of congregations who've maintained a hybrid mode of worship, have shown an overall growth of 4.5%. So those that have maintained a hybrid mode of worship have had a slight, not a large, but a slight increase. Okay, what about the actual effects of the pandemic itself? Well, not surprisingly, 83% of churches have reported that at least one member tested positive. I'm surprised it's actually only 83%. 17% of congregations had at least one member die from the virus. Church programming, including committee meetings and religious education, prayer groups, other small groups, have actually been better at moving to online and hybrid formats than general worship service. So actually churches have done relatively well in providing resources on a small group level. In fact, however, in spite of that, in that most churches have done well, a large percentage of churches have during the pandemic, completely discontinued fellowship events, which clearly doesn't seem like a wise choice in my mind. And not surprisingly, community service activities like food assistance and counseling and other expectations have grown in almost all congregations. Large numbers have done so. Now, you may be interested in how giving, like financial giving, has gone during the pandemic. Well, it's interesting, of course, the virus hit at a time when there were already fewer Americans going to church during the worship services. And so with that, we have already, there had been a decline. However, some churches are doing okay and some are not. Again, so it's a mixed bag. Interestingly, and I think this is important for us to note, churches of color, especially African-American churches, have been most severely hit by the financial decline and the other affairs. And they know this from the surveys. For example, Friendship Baptist Church in Baltimore, just an example, their pastor was surveyed and he said that they're essentially living week to week. He said that their church received the PPP loan from the government, which was about $55,000, but that's only barely helping them to meet their expenses. And their pastor, Reverend Alvin Gwynn, has given up his salary and is now living off of his Social Security checks and his side construction job. And this is actually rather typical, they say, of African-American churches. And this is something we should be concerned about, I would say. This same pastor, Pastor Gwynn, said that the church is, quote, surviving because of the sacrificial giving of those who are committed. And so that's why it's even surviving. Now, interestingly, though, more upper middle class churches, including maybe some from our own denominations, are doing okay. So, for example, Hope Presbyterian Church in Austin, Texas, a congregation of about 400, have enjoyed relative stability during the pandemic. Their pastor had expected contributions to drop off when in-person services paused, but instead the contributions have remained steady, and so have their pledges. And so the congregation even donated, some of the members of their congregation donated their government stimulus checks to the church, which they're using for financial assistance of people who are in trouble. And so when services went virtual, the savings that church had on their utility costs, because they weren't opening the church building, allowed them to actually keep their employees on the payroll and offset some of their lost revenue from not renting the space. So it's interesting how churches, it depends, sadly, I would say, churches that already had some financial troubles, like this church in Baltimore I mentioned, are finding those situations worsening, while other churches that are relatively stable or had been doing well seem to be doing okay. What about the attitude of churches? And then I'm going to turn it over to Michael. You know that many clergy are struggling, and you've heard probably of some of desired or to quit or actually have done so. Nonetheless, the survey says that 2/3 of clergy, that while 2/3 of the clergy said that this was their hardest year of ministry ever, 2/3 of the clergy said this was their hardest year of ministry. This would have been 2021. Nonetheless, 3/4 of the clergy did not consider leaving their church or doubt their calling. So that's encouraging to me, right? 3/4 of the clergy did not consider leaving or doubting their call. And this is my last point. Ironically, after all this data, much of which is rather negative, the survey from Hartford still indicates that there's a lot of optimism in churches. And I think that's because we're proclaimers of the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's because we have a message that calls us to work and to move ahead, no matter what the conditions, no matter what the situation. In fact, 68% of pastors, 68%, believe that their congregation will emerge from the pandemic stronger than before. So that's more than 2/3. And that's encouraging. A lot of this has to do with their resilience. Churches have been resilient and adaptable, and especially because of their new use of technology. I'm going to give you some quotes from the survey. One church leader said, "Let it never be said again that the church cannot change quickly." And that's good because, as you know, usually we're not accused of being very rapid in our changes, but we did it. We did change quickly. Almost all churches did. Another pastor said, "In a certain way, the virtual experience gave the church a new sense of what it means to be the church in this century." That's interesting. A new sense of what it means to be the church in this century. And then finally, and this will be the segue to Michael, I love this specific quote from the survey. "We," this is one church, "started approaching the topic of innovation as a choice. Then that choice was made for all of us. Now we all had to innovate." And that's exactly what's happened. And in that, we're grateful that we have a gospel that stays the same and is proclaimed, even though the mode of doing so may change. So let me now turn it over to Michael, and thank you. I'll be back for time of questioning at the end.
Great, thanks, Doug. And thank you to all of you who are attending this talk. It's really a great opportunity to be able to explore this important subject together. I'm going to bring up my slide deck here. Hopefully you can all see that. There we go. And so what I want to do is start by giving kind of a bigger picture of what I would describe as our unique technological moment. So, as has been said already, what the church fits into a broader trajectory of change within our society. And so I want to just talk about the contours of that a little bit, and then get into looking at technological change that happened during the pandemic and the changes that were accelerated. The numbers that Doug gave about how many churches went to hybrid is really staggering, and hard to wrap your mind around when you think about what that involved. But nevertheless, the conditions force that upon us. And then I'll end with some emerging trends, and these come out of other surveys that are very consistent with what we're seeing from the Hartford reports. So if we take a step back, there are a number of ways that scholars and others talk about this particular moment we're living through. One term that's been popularized by Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum is this idea of the fourth industrial revolution. For the last few hundred years, we've kind of moved into this mass production of goods. Sort of the emergence of the kind of the corporate cultures that we're familiar with now, and the kind of institutions we're familiar with now, driven largely by new technologies, first powered by steam, then powered by electricity. After the Second World War, the arrival of digital computers. And within the last 10 plus years, we've seen new and more powerful technologies emerge, such as big digital data, artificial intelligence, cloud computing that makes all this stuff possible. And connects everything, and then smart devices, this proliferation of intelligent technologies into our world. And so this is changing rather dramatically, every dimension of our lives and our institutions. And this is something that was happening before the pandemic, but the pandemic has accelerated a lot of these trends. Another way of looking at this moment that we're living through is described by a philosopher, Luciano Floridi, as the fourth modern scientific revolution. This is an information revolution. And like other modern revolutions, that changed how we thought about the universe with Copernicus, or how we thought about, the place of humans in the natural world after Darwin, how we begin to think about the complexities of the human mind following Freud. Now we are faced with the ability to create intelligent agents, artificial intelligence or automated information processing that can do things that previously we thought, well, this is what makes us special as human. And so these technologies pervading our world and our lives are really challenging us to kind of rethink how we relate to these technologies. In institutional contexts and many businesses, the language that's used is digital transformation. And this is a way of describing this trajectory that we've been on regarding digital technologies for, since the mid-20th century, really. It begins with the digitization of stuff, so we started creating digital, records, provide digital access to stuff in the mid-20th century. We've been developing, systems and processes to sort of process this data automatically. More recently, we've been developing these autonomous and intelligent systems. And that's kind of what we're right in the middle of now. We're really in the middle of seeing how these technologies are transforming our lives and our institutions. If you think about a particular technology, the internet, we had the internet had been around for a long time, but when it became more popularly accessible, it was kind of what we call now the Web 1.0. So this is you just put stuff online, and churches, did this. They kind of put some stuff online, kind of shared some, information about churches, shared some, kind of artifacts or recordings, other things. But this is just the church sort of looking at the internet as sort of a supplemental thing. Well, we could put stuff there, and kind of provide access that way. Over the last 20 years, we've seen the emergence of what we now call the Web 2.0. This is the interactive web. So this is social media is the most powerful example of this. And this is a much more interactive platform. And you begin to see within the last 20 years, not just churches putting, kind of extending themselves online, but churches actually just being online. There are some churches that have just started online and stayed online and had dynamic interactions. Doug and I worked with a colleague who, as a teenager, started a church in a gaming environment called Roblox, and found a way to kind of meet, a lot of young people, and create a place where they could kind of come and worship. And he ended up with, what looked pretty much like a church, but it was all virtual. And now we're just beginning to think what the Web 3.0 looks like. You may have heard recently a lot of talk about what's being called the metaverse. And this is largely conceptual at this point, largely marketing at this point, but it's thinking about how we interact with technologies, not just, you think of virtual reality, that's like you go online, you put on a headset and you kind of do stuff in this virtual space. It's very separate from your kind of embodied experience. But now we have technologies that are called augmented reality. So, I might put on glasses and I'm sitting here in my office and I can sort of see overlays and interact with digital information in a much more dynamic way that's enhancing my environment. And we have a lot of technologies that are kind of moving into the wild, becoming embodied in a way in the physical world, and in a much more blended and integrated way. And in a bit, I'll kind of talk about blended church and how we might think of that a little bit differently than hybrid church. And all of this is moving. The trajectory here is moving to a point when we have all of these technologies kind of integrated into our lives, kind of like we eventually integrate electricity into our lives and stop thinking about electric things. We just had, power that surrounded us. You can think of an analogy of, the internet will be something that's just kind of around us, like electricity, not something we go onto, but it's just integrated into our lives. So thinking about churches, before the pandemic, probably one of the most important scholars in this space is Heidi Campbell. And I'm pretty much from here on out just going to talk about a lot of Heidi's work, because she's been in this space, one of the first scholars to start thinking about religion online and writing about it, and had 20 years of scholarship in this area when the pandemic hit. We invited her. She gave a talk at a virtual summit we held with our Murdoch grant. You can actually watch her keynote. It's still available online. But Heidi talks about 3 different strategies that churches have used. And this was true before the pandemic, and these were picked up by different churches during the pandemic as well. And the first is simply like transferring stuff online. And so the great example here is just streaming video. So we have a service in the building, we're going to stream that online and provide another way of access. So that's kind of church online. The easiest thing to do, what a lot of churches default to do during the pandemic. A much more dynamic way of using web-based technologies enter the space of translating. So how do we adapt our regular practices using a new platform? So the example here is a lot of churches use this platform here, Zoom, to web conferencing platform, but they started to, they adapted what they wanted to do in Zoom. So at the church I go to, Bethany Presbyterian Church, we launched Zoom, and they had to reconfigure the service. They had to kind of adapt to this new environment and did things in a different way. Because they had this new platform, and we weren't just going to stream from the sanctuary, but we were going to come together on this platform and do something a little bit different. And so that's the translation, that's adapting to a new platform. But then once you've made that move, then the next move, what Heidi calls practices that are more transforming. And this is where you actually start to do new things based on what you can do with the new technologies you're using. So now that we're in Zoom, we have new features. We have new things we can do, like the chat. So again, just to stay with my example, we began to share prayer requests through chat. And that was much more interactive, and it was different. And it was a new way of sharing prayers, where we used to just kind of, pray out loud when prompted. So it was a new way of people participating and engaging in the service that the platform, because of the features in it, allowed. And there are more interesting examples, I'm sure, that are out there, and new ones that will continue to emerge. But what all this is going toward is, now that you have these new technologies, how do you integrate, how do you adapt to using these technologies? How do you do new things with these technologies? And then the challenge after that, looking forward, is how do you bring these things together? So we've already used the term hybrid church, which is, you've got stuff. Usually it's based in a building. That's kind of where you're rooted, and then you kind of extend that into a digital space. That's and somehow you kind of try to bring these things together, but it really is a dualistic way of thinking about. We go on, we've got the online people, we have the in-person people. Whereas in the future, as these technologies become more integrated, churches and other organizations are beginning to, try to think about how do we actually bring these things together? How do we kind of integrate? And that will require new facilities, new technologies, and so forth. And we're just at the beginning of that. But hybrid isn't the end. Hybrid is more of a transitional of, we have these, we used to just be in person, then we added online, and now we have these two things. But how do we break down that duality? So during the pandemic, Heidi, because she had been in the space for so long and knew so many people, she reached out during the pandemic. She was actually, during a lockdown, she was trapped in Germany, and her sabbatical plans were a bit hijacked. So she just wrote. She started reaching out to all the people she knew, and she said, tell me what's going on. So she got reflective essays from scholars in the field, from pastors in the field. And she published this book, open ebook called The Distance Church, and at the beginning of the pandemic. And it's a really interesting snapshot of what was going on at the time. She continued to publish these things. She published a couple more book length, collections of essays, looking at religion more broadly, and then, delving into kind of, some of the ongoing things that were happening as the pandemic continued. Now the nice thing that Heidi did is she also wrote kind of a summary of the trends that she saw over those 3 books, as well as other conversations she had, podcasts she'd been involved in. And earlier last year now, about a year ago, she published kind of the big 10 trends that she had identified in her research and her conversations. And I'll run through these, pretty quickly. I can share the slide deck with you later if you're interested. And I don't think any of these will come as a shock to anyone. I think they rather confirm what a lot of us have experienced individually, or heard about anecdotally. But the first point is that if churches were avoiding technology before or reluctant, they really had to overcome that, and they had this, they had to take advantage of these technologies just to continue to, to function and to connect, and pursue their mission. The experimentations reveal the power of these technologies that the people hadn't really had a lot of experience with or thought about much. It raised questions, and some of these things are questions that still need to be held in front of us as we continue to move forward. Is traditionally the value of being embodied has been held up and affirmed, but how much and in what form of practice, of our communal practice does need to be embodied. The fourth point here is that it really, anytime you go through one of these rapid disruptions, I mean, it really reveals what's important. What are the core beliefs you want to hold on to? What are the core practices that you want to bring forward in new conditions? Those churches that have been flexible and willing to innovate are better positioned for the additional changes that are still coming that I mentioned in my introductory comments. And therefore these innovations shouldn't be shelved and churches shouldn't go back. I mean, Doug's statistics, from that report, suggest, what will happen, what that trajectory looks like. But as churches continue to, kind of reflect on what's happened, reflect about what's happening, what's going to be happening next, and leveraging that, those are churches that are more likely to thrive, not just in the context, but with the people, with all of us who more and more have, whether it's school, whether it's work, whether it's, our personal relationships, those have become much more technologically mediated than they were before. And so church, if the church doesn't do that, it's going to feel rather different. And that may be a good point of resistance, but the larger challenge remains. So this, from the beginning, of this session, we've been talking about, this really does challenge us to understand what community looks like. And if traditionally we thought about the church as at least a local, manifestation of a church, a congregation as a building where people went at a certain time and came together physically. Now that the church is extended into these different spaces and is integrating these spaces, what does community? What are the characteristics of that? And this does change how we think about the online and how we integrate that into the offline. The last 2 points here are that that obviously we need to be thinking about these decisions pretty intentionally. How we are integrating these technologies in the church, and as we do this, it's important to not leave anyone behind. This I think is something, if we think about the church as a witness to the broader culture, this is a space I think where the church could have a prophetic voice in thinking about how do we move forward with technologies in an equitable and inclusive way. It's a huge challenge for our culture in pretty much every dimension of our culture, but technology has a tendency to exacerbate historic inequities as well as create new ones. As we've talked about earlier, as Doug talked about earlier, the church historically has often been at the front, at the leading edge of new technologies, often for the purpose of spreading the gospel, and has been able to see those technologies shaped in good ways. And I think there's still significant opportunity for that. And yet another Heidi Campbell report that just came out. Heidi is also continuing to have conversations and study groups. And so this is the most recent one that I'm aware of. She's kind of hard to keep up with. But this is from November of 21. And conducted a number of studies asking questions. And so this is a little bit more recent information. I think this is interesting, and that still, the pandemic is still continuing. And so we see a lot of continuity here from what we've seen with other reports, such as Hartford's. But, asking questions in all these interviews, who made the major decisions about technology? What were the challenges and successes? And what do these mean for the future? The who is primarily pastors. Are making these decisions with a lot of help from volunteers, and with a lot of unfamiliarity about these technologies. And this created a lot of challenges, making decisions about what equipment, sorting out issues about copyright when you're providing stuff online. What are the permissions and rights you have to negotiate with that? The difficulty of starting from scratch, acquiring the technology, getting the stuff in place, troubleshooting issues live, keeping volunteers, finding volunteers and keeping them. When the pandemic has extended on so long and burnout is a real issue. A lot of anti-tech sentiments among staff and congregations. I could give a whole nother talk on this, because this perplexes me. I understand it, and I can explain it, but it always perplexed me before the pandemic. And I think perhaps one of the biggest things that the pandemic has forced is, a forced positive experience in some ways for many of the opportunities of technology. And so, I hope a few years from now, we don't have that anti-tech presence in church culture. and again, defining community online. How do we think about community when it isn't all, in the same time in the same place, but is extended through networks? And again, I think there are really interesting historical precedents there that can be thought of. You talk about the use of roads and epistles and the codex, the networks that the church was able to build, in the past before we had any of these, electronic or digital technologies. Successes, expanded reach. As Doug said, this was a surprise to many. The power of this platform, Zoom, and others for engagement. That the churches were able to connect not just with new people, but actually people that they weren't connected with, who didn't live in the area anymore. And even live streaming, even something as basic as live streaming, created some important connections for a lot of churches. And again, reconceptualizing what is church now, given these new technologies. In terms of the future, the questions of how to define it, it's hard to do hybrid well. If we're in person, we tend to focus on the in-person, and it's hard to maintain attention or focus on those online. I would push this further and say it isn't balance, it really is integration. And what does that look like? What would we want that to look like? What would the platforms be that the church might design, rather than grabbing a meeting platform like Zoom and saying, okay, well, let's stuff our stuff into this box? What if the church developed its own technologies? What would that look like? And how will culture change? How many people will return to the kind of the familiar practices that were pretty well established for a long time during the 20th century? And then, of course, a lot of questions around liturgical implications. This varies across tradition depending on your sacramentology, but nevertheless, every church has had to kind of confront what do you do about baptism? What do you do about communion? So to go back to the first slide I had on digital transformation, again, this is where we are right now. We are in the middle of digital transformation. This is not just churches. This is every institution, and this is us. In our individual lives, as we have phones, these powerful computers we walk around with these AI capabilities, to recognize our voice, to recognize our faces, to perform tasks, that we command, and to give us suggestions of what to do. This is happening. And so the opportunity for us, especially for institutions and especially for the church, is to enter into the space and proactively design the future and not let others do that. And I hope Doug told me to, I was supposed to be the positive person. I'm going to end with a little bit of a negative example here, just to give you a sense of what's at stake, because this article was published just a couple of days ago, and it was a privacy analysis of prayer apps. So as more and more people spend time online, and this article talks about, especially during the pandemic, a lot of people are turning to social media platforms and some kind of religious social media platforms without really realizing who's funding these and how they operate. And so what this article did, it said, look, if you use this app for free, you're the product. The app doesn't really care about your spiritual life or your prayers or anything. What it cares about is your data. It wants your data because it can use that data to suggest things that you might want to buy. It can take that data and sell to other people that can come back and sell stuff through this platform or another platform. And when you click on these things, you don't read the terms and agreements. None of us do, because they're long and you don't really have a choice. But what you miss by not reading that is all the disclosures that this company is tracking you, is tracking your data, everything you say, and it's going to use that for its own end. And there's a lot of money pouring into religious apps right now from Silicon Valley. I mean, the major the major venture capitalists are buying stuff. They're developing stuff because this is a new market for them. And they're even targeting churches. They're actually trying to get Facebook and others are actually asking churches and denominations to sign non-disclosure agreements so they can get their stuff sort of, blessed by the church, so that the church will then use these platforms so that they can get the data and then they can make money off that data without people fully understanding the mechanisms at work. So that's the space that will be filled in by these large tech companies if churches aren't wiser and Christians aren't wiser about how we engage with these platforms and how we can use these platforms to ultimately pursue the mission ends that we would. So that is that's where we're at. And, I want to stop because I did want to leave a little bit of time for questions for for Doug or me. But thank you for the invitation and for your attention.
I have a question.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Up front, it was mentioned, something I've heard over the years, that technology is essentially neutral. It's all on how you use it. But I've had my suspicions. And I think that your excellent presentation today dispelled any notion that I might have had that technology is purely a neutral device and it's all a matter of how we use it. Your earlier slide with Freud said, if I remember how you put it, that we are not transparent to ourselves. And I suspect that's the case right now. And I think social analysis 75 years from now will probably have a better handle on this. But my suspicion is simply this, that technology is changing things. It's like, do we put the sausage in a really tight container or in a loose container or something like that? So that determines what the sausage will taste like. How do you think technology is in fact changing the nature of, Jesus Christ is Lord, name in the name of the Father, but how is it really changing the substance? And I'm not afraid of that. God is God, God is sovereign. But how do you think it's actually changing the substance of what we're about?
The substance of what we're about. That's an interesting way of putting it. I think that technology. We've always been shaped by technology, from the beginning, and we shape it. It shapes us. That's kind of a common refrain. You'll hear, by people who study technology, society and technology. So I guess I see continuity and change. I think some things are substance, a certain continuity, in terms of, what we're created to be and what we're created for. But I do see change over time that's sometimes driven by technology, and I think that's why it's important for us to sort of jump in and and make sure that this is all people, right? There's no force out there. Well, spiritual forces, but this is all people doing stuff. And so in terms of emphasizing the role of human agency in this process is really important for individuals, but more importantly for institutions.
Are you sure there's no force out there? Just kidding.
Well, it's not an artificial force, I guess is my point. I mean, we do create systems that then take on their own agency. You know, this is you know, you can look at Jacques Ellul's critique of the city in the Bible, or interpretation of the city in the Bible, or more broadly technology in society, that we create these really powerful systems and tools, and they do start to take on their own kind of automated agency. And we have to work very hard to, you know, to control that. Ellul's very skeptical that about our ability to do that. I'm a little bit more optimistic because I do believe there, and we can also talk about, you know, spiritual powers that get caught up in all that. But I also believe that, you know, that there is a divine agency that also is sort of working through all this too. And so yes, there are many levels of power that are, you know, our individual agency, you know, kind of the more systemic, you know, agencies that we, you know, that we get started or that we sustain or that we have to kind of, you know, intervene and correct. But then there is also a spiritual dimension to all of this too.
If I heard your question correctly, you're asking, is the substance of the message changed? If I'm correctly, and I would argue throughout church history, the substance of the message has changed, depending on the context, and certainly with the, as Michael mentioned, the systemic forces, which are broader than just our individual understandings. It's always been true.
If I may, I think that that's consistent with the whole notion of incarnation. What comes through something, that something actually has a way of making that something slightly different.
Well, certainly our perception of it, whether you know, whether that's true ontologically, I'm not sure. We can't get to that. I would say we don't know what that is. But our perception certainly changes.
I'd like to thank our speakers. You have really enlightened us in some ways, and some of it we're well acquainted with because we're experiencing it, going through it right now. Before I was in high school, before either of you were born, and a book that I have never forgotten. It actually was a short story. I don't remember the name of the author, but it was called The Machine Stops.
Yes, yeah.
And everybody lived in a little cubicle. They were afraid of interaction if they ever ventured outside. And the machine would always open, bring their food, and take care of all of their needs and so forth. The picture that has developed, I think, is a lot different than that, in that here we are able to see one another. And even though it's not the same and we are social creatures, we're really anxious to get back to in-person worship, as well as taking advantage of the digital Zoom provisions, platforms, so forth. But any reflections you might have about the picture that was projected more than 70 years ago and where we are today would be appreciated.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that and know it. It's Ian Forster. It's a great little short story. And a lot of people think about it when we think about, you know, people who just go like all into virtual, like, you know, I'm only going to sit in front of my computer. It's the only way I want to deal with people. You know, there was, I guess I have two thoughts related to that. Around the same time, there was a Czech playwright who wrote a play and performed it in 1920, I think, 2021, called RUR. It was the first play where robots are mentioned. And the robot is introduced as this, you know, it's kind of what you think a robot would be, kind of this autonomous automaton. But his point, Čevik's point, was that you know, we had created something we had lost control of, this Industrial Revolution. Again, this is over 100 years ago, so, you know, pre-digital. But he said we can't stop. I mean, if we stop, many will suffer. If we'll continue, many will suffer. So he was kind of stuck, and for him, the robot was kind of this apocalyptic figure that said, this is what we've created. We're going to do about it. So that's one point. And I think Forrester was trying to say the same thing, is like, we're on this trajectory. What's going to happen? Are we just going to kind of end up, we can't stop it. And if it did stop, is that possible? And what would it look like? But your point about relationships, I mean, I do think that there is part of us that is just not going to be completely satisfied, living in a machine entirely, or just sort of surrendering to, sort of the optimization of kind of a mechanistic view of the world, and people will rebel and resist that, and that's appropriate at times. What I want to advocate for is much more, kind of proactive design, based on what is important to us and based on our values, so that we don't end up in the machine, or we don't end up with this, kind of robot that wants to destroy us.
Right. I'd like to say something to Doug. Of all of my classmates at Princeton Seminary, class of 1963, the most exemplary of the classmates who has done more to bring us together, to keep us together for alumni gatherings and other communications has been our friend Don Black, United Methodist minister, whom I am so grateful for. And so anyway, just wanted to add that.
Well, John Wesley said he was just within a hair's breadth of Calvinism. So there we go.
Okay. Well, thank you both. This was just marvelous. And for some reason, we didn't have the link publicized by email the way we have in past. I wanted to send it to some others, and I know that will be done in the future, so that this presentation will be viewed, I'm sure, by many when we're able to access that. So thank you again.
So Larry, you want to ask a question?
Well, I just wanted to say thank you. I was just about 10 months into what turned out to be a 2.5-year interim when COVID hit, and it was an extraordinarily disorienting time. I would have to say I fought the technology most of the way. I had a couple of staff guys that were big techies and hugely helpful in bringing the thing across. But now that I'm over that, done with that interim, and I'm very much wanting to see what you guys, as well as Terry and others, are going to do. And this today has been extremely helpful. We clearly have to pivot. We clearly have to make these changes, because this is the new 95 Theses. They're on the door, and they're going to get read whether we like it or not.
That's a great analogy, by the way. I think you're right. I think we're at not only a pivotal point ecclesiologically, but our whole culture is, right? And so in the same way that those kinds of changes we're making were throughout Western Europe in those years, we're now globally having to pivot. So I agree with you.
I have two information questions. One is, when you attend church on Sunday via the internet, it just says maybe 20 people are watching, but how can you determine really how many? Because there might be 4 in each household, and that would multiply the number of people watching.
I do know that these folks from the Hartford study came up with a way for determining that number. And it was basically, they also surveyed churches and asked them to find out how many were actually in each household or each place. And interestingly, the number ended up being just about accurate, so that while there were some that would be have more than one person. There were others that were just one. So I don't remember what the number was, but it couldn't even double the number. It was something like 1.5. But there's a way that they could gather that statistic.
My other question is, how many churches use their stimulus checks income to promote their tech possibilities?
Yeah, so this was actually asked by the Hartford folks too, and quite a few did. Many of them did actually for exactly that purpose. However, as was noticed, some of the churches that struggled the most just had to use that stimulus money just to survive.
Thank you.
Again, back to Michael's point about vulnerable populations, this is somewhere where our churches could really, and by our, I mean sort of upper middle class white churches, could be really helpful by recognizing that other churches in our community might need some tech help or some expertise that we already have, and could we let them borrow that or help them out? This is where we could be really neighborly.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested in seeing, one point that Doug made, and I've seen in the research too, is that a lot of churches added to their, kind of public services outreach, and I'm really interested in that, because one of the, Doug's point that you're in a local area, right, and there are other churches that you may have relationships with, but that could be dealing with the same or rather different struggles, and there was an opportunity for churches to kind of look around and see, what are other congregations in this area doing? Can we help each other, based on our, co-location at least. At the same time, I mean, one of the things that was a bit of a head scratcher for me, because I saw other cities do it, but in Seattle, we have a public school system that's very big and very diverse, and they're very focused on educational justice. And so while some schools are very wealthy and have technology and the ability to just say, here's a device, go learn online, other schools do not. So the system made a decision: we are not going to do something that is inequitable. We're not going to create an environment in which some students succeed and some don't. Some school districts, they all went online and they were fine. Seattle public school system really struggled, and a lot of them didn't do much. They sent homework packets, or you come pick up stuff. And it created a lot of burdens for parents. Again, we're all working online, trying to adapt, and now kids are in the house, and they don't have any schoolwork to do, or they need help with their schoolwork because they've been given assignments they have to work on and turn in. And what I would have wished would have happened is that churches with buildings that weren't being used, maybe some volunteer hours, the programs that weren't operating. Maybe there could have been opportunity where churches kind of looked literally across the street and said, how can we help, families struggling based on what's going on in the Seattle public school system? I know there are cities that did things like that, set up tutoring centers and things like that. So with the technology, that's one thing that changes what the church is, and how the church is networked with others and other institutions online. But it also, gives you an opportunity to think locally, what are the local networks that at the same time, we can be involved with and seeing the new needs there.
This has been a fantastic conversation, and I'm going to draw things together here. And I really like your title. This is the digital transformation of the church. We've always heard we are being transformed, and it can be something that's just happening to us, or we can be a part of the change. But you've given us some tools so we can enter into it. Just a footnote here is, I am excited from Monte Vista Grove that we have San Marino Community Church, who is offering us their Director of Digital Ministries, Jonas Streffer, to help us put this program on. And it will be available for people who will look at our website after a few days. This has been a fantastic program. Thank you so much. And blessings on you at Seattle Pacific College University.
Thank you, and God bless you.
Yes, thank you so much.
So next week, we are beginning Black History Month, and we're going to make something of Black History Month. Catherine Hughes, resident here at Monte Vista Grove, has put together a beautiful program on music written and composed by African-American musicians. And the context is going to be not just a speaker, but prayers by Charles Marx. Jeannie Cobb is going to sing the Black National Anthem. I hope Catherine will offer some of her own experiences as a Black female pastor. And then the speaker will be Perry Hayes, who has led a number of choirs and groups. He has recorded with Barry Manilow, Winston Marsalis, Diane Reeves. He's a great speaker. You'll enjoy it. Next week, 4 o'clock, come and enjoy our beginning of Black History Month. Thank you for watching.